questions about that, but I've also wanted, while this morning in questions we talked about the role of a judge and other things of that sort, I wanted to tell you that, I also do, because American judges are generalists and do everything, so I'm also a constitutional court judge and involved in questions of constitutional law and its application and the citation of foreign law and do we use law, constitutional law in other countries and so on. So that whole side, which is something else that you do here, and you might want to know about how an American judge who does that, and specifically in a federalist situation, because the United States is a federalism, which tells you something. So I put that out as something else to talk about in questions if you would like. Now about altruism. If you read what economists do with altruism, they always ask this question: is it better to get from here to here through altruistic, not-for-profit, or is it better, more efficient, to get from here to here through self-interest? Can education be given better in an altruistic way or in a for-profit way? Can we produce shoes better in an altruistic way or in a for-profit way? And when they do that, they almost always find that it's more efficient to do it in a self-seeking, self-interested, for-profit way. It's more efficient to produce medical care, education, bananas, whatever it is, in a for-profit way. And then they're surprised at the fact that there is so much altruism, so much beneficence in the world. So many things which are not matters of self-seeking. And they don't understand it. And they then occasionally come up with quite interesting evolutionary theories of why being altruistic has some benefit for the human species somehow, somewhere here. It's all it may be true and it's very interesting, but it's very far gone. Well, that's the law, the economic analysis of law. When you look at it and you see the world, and the world doesn't make sense, and you say, gee, it must be absurd. It doesn't make sense. The law economics person looks at that and says, is there something wrong with the theory? With the way we are structuring the question? And the first thing that comes to mind is, why do you look at altruism, beneficence, as a means, as a way of getting from here to here? Why not look at it as something which we like, which we have in our utility functions, to speak the way economists do, which we simply have? Why not ask, not whether altruism is a good way of producing something, but whether it's something we like? Think about it this way. Caviar, as a way of feeding ourselves, is very inefficient. It costs an awful lot to live off caviar, and yet people buy caviar because they like it. champagne as a way of dethirsting ourselves is not very efficient. It costs much more than water. And yet people buy champagne because they like it. Sex as a way of procreating is very inefficient. We could all procreate in the way bulls do in bull farms. But we don't do that because sex is more fun. Why not look at altruism as something which is not a means, but which is an end, which is something that we have and are willing to pay for to spend money for because we like it, because we want people to be nice. And you ask yourself, it's so obvious. Economists supposedly say nothing about tastes. We'll have more to say about that tomorrow, about tastes and values. Why don't they simply take it for granted? In the way people like caviar, or like bananas, or like sex, or like this, or like that they like people to be nice. That they like people not to be self-seeking. Why do they need to come up with complicated evolutionary reasons why people like people to be nice? They don't come up with complicated evolutionary reasons as to why we like caviar or champagne or even sex. It just people like it. Why do they do this with respect to altruism? And then, when you ask that question, you come up with a rather interesting answer. And I call it Mckeon's paradox because it was stated by an economist in Virginia named Roland Mckeon, who said, it is meaningless to ask, how much must I pay you to love me for myself alone? If I pay you to love me, you don't love me. It's meaningless to use the market as a way of increasing the amount of beneficence. But if it is meaningless to use the market as a way of benevolence, it's also meaningless to say, how can I compel you to love me for myself alone? If I force you to be good, I don't get the pleasure of your being good. You're not good, I've forced you. And by the way, the same thing is true in reverse in malevolence. If I simply pay you not to be malevolent, I don't get the pleasure of your not being malevolent, I still think you're malevolent. Or if I beat you not to be malevolent, the same thing. There are some goods, and this is a typical law and economic move, there are some goods which the classic ways that economists use to optimize them, to get the right amount, things we want, in which the classical ways that they use don't work. Don't work because the market destroys it. Compelling it destroys it. And so economists, not being able to analyze these in the classical market ways, act as if they're not there. And don't think of them as ends, as goods in themselves, but only as means. And the fact that the world is different, that there are any number of not-for-profits, that there are any number of altruistic behaviors which don't justify themselves as means, as ways of getting from here to there, are there, get simply ignored. But again, the moment you start thinking this way, you realize something else. Yeah, I can't pay you to love me for myself alone, but candy helps. That is, I can give gifts, which aren't quite mine, but make you be nice, and that doesn't destroy the good. And if I can't compel you to be good, because compulsion destroys it also, education, which is a very powerful form of command, may be able to cause people to be good, to be altruistic, and not destroy it. In other words, if you get away from pure markets and from pure command, which is the way the economist traditionally thinks, then you can do something about these goods and these bads. You can actually analyze them and do more. And there are any number of different things. Mixed command, mixed market. The charitable deduction in the United States, which reduces the amount that it costs you to make charitable contributions, has meant that the United States is one of the most charitable. People give money. It becomes a habit. Then, even if you got rid of the charitable deduction, immediately you still would have people contributing. After time, it might reduce itself and go away, but at the moment, people give because that's the culture of giving, and so we have more altruism, which is the good that we want. And there are other kinds of commands. In Minnesota, where my wife's family, part of her family comes from, it used to be the case that the old families, the old companies, decided that they would give 5% of their gross to charity. And new companies that came in, the owners of them simply would not be accepted into society if their companies didn't do the same. A pretty powerful form of command, but it created an atmosphere in Minneapolis where the moment there's a problem, people throw money at it. It was command, but it increased the amount of altruism enormously, and it made people feel very happy because they wanted the altruism. Now, think in terms, again, of the relationship between law and economics. This says to economists, don't just think of economics and economic theory in terms of pure markets and pure command. Now think of it in terms of a much more complicated system in which we often use semi-hemi-demi markets and semi-hemi-demi commands because they work better. Return for a moment to Coase and the theory of the firm. Remember Coase saying, if markets were costless, there would be no firms, but there are firms. So let's add to the mixture the notion that markets cost money, because firms are command structures. That's all Coase saying. But if you look at it, the command that occurs in a firm is not the classic command of economic theory. The classic command of economic theory is centralized governmental command. When economists talk of markets and command, they talk about compulsion by the government, central, and markets. The firm is not that kind of command at all. It's a highly decentralized, private form of command. Coase, without thinking about it, was describing a hemi, semi, demi type of command. By looking at altruism in this way, we start asking ourselves, what mixtures of markets, semi-markets, markets which are not pure, markets in gifts, markets in time, markets in this, and what kinds of commands, centralized, decentralized, private, and others, are the most efficient ways of optimizing a particular good. So we not only now can say something about altruism, but we can say something about any number of other goods and bads which are best allocated not by pure market or by pure command. Return to what I was saying this morning about body parts. We may find it offensive to value your life or your privates in a money sense and say that is what your privates are worth, or that is what. But we may also find it offensive to say, your life I take, yours I don't. That is pure command and pure pricing. We don't want to price life. We don't want to price certain parts of the body. But we also don't want to say, at the highest level, we take yours, yours we leave you. Example, when the Pentagon Papers case, the case involving the publication of papers during the war in Vietnam, the question was, do we allow prior restraint? Do we allow the government to prevent these secrets from being published? It goes before the Supreme Court. And Potter Stewart, the justice I was talking to you about before, asked Alexander Bickel, my colleague, who was arguing the case for the New York Times for the right to publish, said, counsel, if 100 young men and women would die if we allowed publication, would not this be a sentencing to death of 100 young men and women? Would you not then allow us to bar publication ahead of time, prior to impose a prior restraint? Bickel started to answer this as an academic, and then remembered he was arguing the case as a lawyer, and he said, Mr. Stewart, that isn't this case, don't worry about it. Worry about that case if it ever comes up. And that's what Stewart did, wrote the opinion, said, we don't worry about complicated cases where it might be. Justice Black, for whom I had clerked before, whose last opinion it was, he was old and dying, and he wrote a wonderful vintage Black opinion, said to his clerk, Stewart had the right question, but the answer they gave was wrong. The problem was not that 100 lives would be lost. We waste, in the parlance of the time, 100 lives all the time for things that are less important than freedom of speech. Think of a number of accidents we tolerate. What was not acceptable was to have the highest form of government, the Supreme Court of the United States, saying, your life isn't worth it, yours is. That's not acceptable. We then always have to come out of the side of life. If instead the rule is no prior restraint, the lives are lost before it ever comes to court. The lives are never treated that way. The hostages are taken, are killed before they are taken, and we don't spend millions to try to save them, to say life is a pearl beyond price. Command and markets, pure, don't work well for certain types of goods. And it's not just altruism, it's any number of tragic situations. When some fool decides to row across the Atlantic Ocean, we spend a huge amount of money to save that person as a symbol of what life is worth. And if we don't want to decide, you die. If we spent that money to make coal mines safer, we would save more lives. And yet, we are doing something which is important, because we cannot allocate them in the same simple market and non-market way. What you learn from altruism, and how we treat and not treat altruism, and the fact that we can do more about it, is that a true theory of economics and of economic efficiency has to look beyond the simple market and beyond the simple command to complicated mixtures in order to optimize the amount of some goods, not all of them. Some we can do in the simple market way, but for others, it is too costly in Coasian terms to do that. Okay, and so that's nice. That's one of the things that a law and economics approach looks at. But what more can we say about altruism? When you start looking at it this way, you suddenly realize that altruism and beneficence is not just one good. It is not just that I want you to be nice and him not to be malevolent, which is harder. It's easier to make you nice and to make him malevolent. It is, I'm not just interested in private beneficence. If everybody were as nice as could be, but the government were nasty and brutish, I wouldn't be happy. What I want is a government that's nice too. How nice? Well, we'll see. If the government were a wonderfully caring government, cradle to grave, look after everything and everybody, but individuals were nasty all the time, I would not be happy. That is, I don't want only private beneficence, private altruism in my utility function, in what I like. I want people to be nice, and I want a government that's nice. And I also, interestingly, to some extent, want firms, private companies to be nice. If you don't believe me, see how private companies do, for their own good, some nice behavior. The New York Yankees, I happen to be a baseball fan and a New York Yankees fan, every year they send all their players out to hospitals and do things like that, and we all feel very good. It makes us feel happy that this big money-making enterprise behaves in a nice way, even though it costs some money. Because I get pleasure, as I do from drinking champagne, but also as I do from drinking Barolo. That is, these are goods which are close, to some degree substitutable for each other, but not the same good. People want individual beneficence, and they also want some government beneficence, and they also want some firm beneficence. How much? That's the question. How much? How do we optimize the amount of these things that we have? And that's a problem, because while caviar and champagne are things which we can count on the market to tell us how much, when you're talking about beneficence, it's harder. To the extent that we were willing to do it all by command, that is, all by semi-hemi-demi command, of saying, we want to spend this much in order to have people be beneficent. We want to spend this much it's worth our while to have people be, a government be good, or firms be good, then it would be a collective decision and fine. But how can you create a situation in which we have indicia of individuals acting privately in mixed market ways tell us how much beneficence we want? And how can we get them to do it in a way which tells us how much private beneficence, how much government beneficence, and how much firm beneficence we want? That's not easy. If you look around, you'll see that we have an awful lot of altruistic forms, not-for-profit forms, that are there that would not justify themselves as means. But we also see that these forms tend not to be all over the place. That is, education, health, tends to be structured in not-for-profit ways. The making of shoes or bananas doesn't tend to be. Why? Is it that as a means, the cost is less to have beneficence in education than in making shoes or bananas? Perhaps. You know, one question is going to be, how much does it cost us to have people be beneficent? We want people to be beneficent, but we don't want to spend too much on it. So if we get more beneficence for the buck in education than we do in shoemaking, then we'll do it there. But it may also be that there are some areas where the beneficence counts for more. It makes us feel better if in education or in health or in certain things people are beneficent, structures are beneficent, than in others. We may want people to be more beneficent in certain contexts, firms to be more beneficent in certain contexts, and the government to be more beneficent in those contexts. Nobody has ever looked at that. Nobody has asked if these goods, governmental beneficence, private beneficence, and firm beneficence, are both ends and means, because they are means of delivering a good, education or what have you, and ends in themselves, something we want. What is the optimal mixture? What gives us the most of what we want? What makes us happiest in terms of seeing people, firms, and governments behave in a way that makes us happy and yet costs us less, least in terms of getting to the results that we want. And that study hasn't been made because economists have been limited to looking at pure markets and pure commands. Now, it isn't only because they've been looking at markets and command in pure form, but they've also tended to think of goods and bads as being either ends or as means. If you start to think of the fact that most goods are both things we like in themselves, and start asking about why do we like them, is it good to like them? Shaping values and taste, that I'll be talking about tomorrow morning. And as means of feeding ourselves, that most goods are like caviar, or wine, or sex, things which have value, plus or minus, things we like or dislike in themselves, things we want in themselves, but they're also useful for something else. We then get an economic system something which is to be optimized when you go out and do your work, either as scholars or as lawyers, that is much more complicated than the world the economist has been living in. So think about what is the most efficient way of both pleasing us by creating up niceness and getting either bananas or education or health. And once we know that, what is the most efficient way of inducing that? By command, semi-command, market, semi-market. Does this make the world too difficult for the economist? You know, we said this morning that one of the powers of economics is that it can be relatively rigorous in relation to social sciences. Can it handle these situations? Or can it say, look, I cannot make an economic model which uses semi-markets. Or I cannot make an economic model which treats goods as though substitutes for each other in desire and as means, and both ends and means in themselves. I can't do it. And if economics can't, then something else is going to have to do it. It doesn't mean that the issue doesn't go away. We may not be able to talk about it in the rigorous way that economics is used to doing and help lawyers decide what rules we want in the society, because we're still going to want these things whether economics can help us with them or not. We're still going to want to have education and health, and we're still going to want to have people be nice, both at an individual and at a firm and at the governmental way, and we're going to want a mixture of them, and we're going to have to make judgments about that. And as lawyers, we can't help but make judgments about that. And the question is, how do we do it? Do we do it in a purely formal way? Do we do it in the other? Or can this discipline help us to know what we want? Economists, as I say, have been reluctant to do that, but they've been reluctant because they haven't even looked at it. And I go back again to Coase and to markets being costly. Before Coase said, let's treat markets as being costly, economists hadn't done it. It was easier. I'd like to know, I'd like a new generation of economists influenced by lawyers and the demands that lawyers make to try to do some complicated models, which are of mixed markets and mixed command, of goods that are both ends and means, and of goods that are substitutes for each other in the sense that we can make do with a little more individual beneficence and a little less governmental, or vice versa, because all of them satisfy us, but in somewhat different ways. I'd like economists to try to see whether they can put together, models that can, to some extent, deal with this more complex reality, which is the world not just of altruism. It is the world of altruism, beneficence and maleficence, but which also becomes the world of how we treat so many goods and bads, which in my book with Philip Bobbitt I call tragic choices, decisions which cannot be made decently, let alone well, but which we make all the time. How many people will live? How many people will die? Who gets the kidney? Who gets a transplant? Who gets to have children? All of these questions which are questions that in different ways, but like altruism, cannot be handled well by simple traditional markets. Economists, if they were able to do something in this way with altruism, would find that they would have tools to deal with. It's a tremendous, tremendous challenge. And yet, it's the future for you guys. You know? How will China handle these things? With a very different cultural tradition, a different use and non-use of market and command, but the questions remain the same. The questions remain the same. It is very difficult for someone who is not from one country to say what is the appropriate mixture of command, market, semi-market for another country. But the questions are the same. When I was writing the book on tragic choices, I used examples of how decisions are made and hidden so that they're not pure market, but you use market incentives. In Italy, in England, and in the United States. And I used those three countries because they were three countries whom I knew, which I knew well. I was born in Italy and I come to Italy all the time, so I know the country well. The United States is where I grew up and I studied in England for several years, so I could say something. It happened that I had, as a research assistant, a guy who had been president of the Harvard Law Review, whose wife was of a great Indian family. Her aunt was Santha Rama Rao, a writer, and her grandmother is Lady Rama Rao, the founder of International Planned Parenthood. And so I asked them, go to India and get me data on how some of these questions, who gets a transplant, who gets picked to serve in a limited war, who gets to have children, are handled there. I thought that I would put them in my book. They came back with wonderful material, which I couldn't use. And I couldn't use because I didn't feel that they might have been able to, but that I understood that society well enough to say some things about the combination of approaches that could be used. I could say something about Italy, England, and the United States, which are cognate society differently. They each handled them somewhat differently. And yet, there were relations which allowed me to say, how you do these complicated mixtures will vary now as the world becomes more one, but that will be the challenge for all of them, to push economists, or to be the economists, who do these more complicated models. And if you start with something as relatively simple as how much beneficence do I want? And beneficence by this nice fellow from the Ukraine, beneficence from Ugo Mattei, who runs firms like you, beneficence of a part of Mr. Monti and the government. What a combination. If you start with that, which seems relatively simple, you will push yourself into making models, into doing things which give economics insight into problems which would really help you decide what kind of a legal structure you want for your society. Thank you. Now, complicated and abstract, but as I say, when it comes to questions, I can talk about that, but also talk about any number of other things, including what judges do as constitutionalists and anything else. So here we are.
I want to ask you this question previous time. We had no time. So back to death penalty.
Back to the death penalty.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think I'm all in favor of it. No.
So once, when I was a student of first year in my country, in Ukraine, in Yale, I heard a very interesting for me notion.
I'm sorry?
I heard one very interesting notion about death penalty. As we know, when somebody commits crime, it's not him, it's his psycho or his mentally. So I heard the idea that when, for instance, somebody committed crime, we should be penalized by death penalty. We should not kill him. We should kill only his psycho or his. We should kill him mentally. So do you think it could be an alternative to death penalty?
Well, if you could find a way to change the person so that that person would not commit that crime, then unless doing that is for other reasons unacceptable, that would obviously be better. When you take a person who has committed a crime and is actually meets the levels of insanity, and you put that person in an insane asylum or give that person medication so that person is not himself, you're doing that. But there is a danger in that if then you do something that destroys other parts of that person, or which says symbolically to others that certain things are done to some people. Let me move from the death penalty to sexual crimes. It is often said that if you take men who rape or who abuse children, why not castrate them? Or remove all of their private parts. Make them incapable of doing that. Why not? It might well do it. It might well mean that the crime is no longer able to be committed, and yet that is something which we don't want to do because historically that kind of torture or treatment was used on certain groups in order to maltreat them, so that it has a cultural connotation that makes it unacceptable, even if it actually worked. I don't think we are either in the position with the death penalty to do the equivalent, or even to judge if we could do the equivalent, whether it would be better. But I'd say be careful, because in other areas of law where it is quite clear that we could do something that would avoid the crime, somehow doing that may be worse than rather awful kinds of punishment that we do. And, you know, something interesting here. Years ago, there were people in a jail in Michigan who were been sex offenders and who were treated terribly, as people who are sex offenders tend to be in jail. They're the ones who are just treated most terribly by other prisoners, violent prisoners and so on, who abuse them, even sexually, because they're sex offenders. And two of these people were willing, asked, one to have a prefrontal lobotomy, which changed his personality, the kind of thing you'd be talking about, and then be able to be released. And the other asked to be castrated. And the prison people said, oh, they don't know what they're doing. They would regret it afterwards, so we won't let this happen. Parentalism, paternalism, paternalism. A colleague of mine, who was then teaching in Michigan, his name is Robert Burton, who is a psychiatrist as well as a law professor, was sent in to see what he thought, whether these people knew what they were doing or not. Whether this was properly a parental thing. And he came away and he said, there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that if I were in their situation, treated as badly as they are in jail, that I would choose prefrontal lobotomy or castration to get out. This isn't a matter of protecting them or being paternalistic. They know what they're doing and they want to do it. By the way, I was too kind to ask my colleague whether you prefer castration or prefrontal lobotomy. For an academic, it's a nice question. So then, why don't we let people do it? Back to Pinto. Because we don't want to know that jails are so horrible for certain people that something as awful as castration or prefrontal lobotomy is genuinely better. We don't want to know that. And yet we don't want to make jails better. Maybe we should. Because we think jails have to be bad to do other things. There are some knowledges that we don't want to have and are willing, in this case, to put a burden on those poor people who are in jail rather than learning to clearly that. Well, the same thing may be true of the death penalty. We don't want to know that what we do with the death penalty is so bad that people would prefer to become non-beings to have it. If one could do something which made them only half-beings, enough. We always simplify. We always simplify, and sometimes it's okay, but sometimes it's not. I was talking to Hugo, who damaged his shoulder, as is in very considerable pain, but who doesn't want to take the things which would cure that pain, because he says it makes me stupid. Doctors very frequently tell you, oh, when people get to be a certain age, pain is not a problem. You know, people don't need to want to die, because we can always take care of the pain with painkillers. But when you get to be my age, and you think of those situations as things which may well happen, you ask yourself, would I prefer pain, or would I prefer to be left there stupid, unable to reason, and in no pain? What I'd like to do is tell doctors, find me a way of easing the pain, but allowing me to remain a human being. And if not, maybe get rid of me. Try to simplify. If we had a way that you say, which was simple and which worked, of course. If we don't, it gets more complicated. There's also another thing about the death penalty, and that is, I don't think the death penalty is that much about the criminal. It seems odd, but no, let's look at the death penalty for a moment and why America has it and other countries like it don't. First, if the death penalty actually reduced the number of murders, then there would be a strong utilitarian argument for it. You know, fewer people get killed, kill a few people. Okay. And the thing about the utilitarianism as a philosophy is that it takes no prisoner. If the death penalty is every once in a while imposed unjustly, but it saves lives, if you're a utilitarian, it doesn't matter. It comes out ahead. The problem with that is that the studies are almost overwhelming, and there's no doubt that the death penalty does not operate to diminish the number of murders. This goes back to studies done by Mckeon, who looked at a part of Italy, Tuscany, that did not have the death penalty, and a part of Italy, Romagna, that did, and found that there were the same number of murders. It's strange. It doesn't seem logical to us, and yet it occurs. And you see it in the United States all the time. Connecticut has the death penalty. Rhode Island next to it does not. They're very similar states. Same number of murders. Vermont doesn't have the death penalty. New Hampshire has the death penalty. Different from Connecticut and Rhode Island. Very similar states. Different number of murders, but the two of them the same. Michigan doesn't. Illinois does. Again, highly industrialized, big states with major cities like Chicago and Detroit, very similar to each other, no differences. And again, it doesn't seem reasonable because to you or to me, it would seem as though the death penalty might deter me. But evidently, there are enough other people whom it induces, people who want to commit suicide dramatically by killing many people. People who are not able to be convicted because you try to convict them in the death penalty and get acquitted. I mean, anyway, it comes out either. So it's pretty clear that it doesn't deter. Then people say, but it's just because there are some people who have committed some crimes that are so horrible that they deserve to die. The trouble with that as a theory for the death penalty is that then the death penalty is manifestly unjust. That is, if the question is, do you occasionally execute somebody who is innocent, and that's a heightened injustice, the answer is yes. But even apart from that, if the idea of the death penalty is that there are some crimes that are so horrible that they deserve it, then the question is, do you impose the death penalty on those crimes or on others because that person didn't have as good a lawyer, was of the wrong race, was of this or that? And it's demonstrable that the death penalty is not enforced in any country which has it fairly in that sense. It's not the worst of the worst. So that doesn't work. Then why do you have it? Well, you have it in the United States, not because of the behavior of the criminal, but because there is this peculiar American, and it's very American, way of the family of the victim wanting retribution, wanting to be made whole. It's my right to have you punished because you hurt me. And that's a utilitarian argument. It's an argument that because I feel better because you did me dirt, that I have a right to be made to feel better. And this, by the way, is a peculiarly, I dislike it intensely, peculiarly American way. It is the basis of constitutional rights. The whole American constitutional structure my right to freedom, my right to this. Most people, my wife's ancestors, when they first landed in New England, the first thing they did to each other was to start suing each other. The moment they landed, it's my right you violated, I'm suing you, it's my right you... They had this peculiarly strong, and the best side of it is in constitutional rights and right to freedom and so on. The worst side of it is this: I have a right to take vengeance on you. And if it worked, it would be a utilitarian argument for the death penalty. I have a right to feel better. The trouble with it, I don't know if it works actually, if people feel better after that. If the killer of their relative gets executed, I doubt it. But I can't prove that in the same way that there's evidence about no deterrence. But the problem with it is that if then you begin with the death penalty only on very few people, the supposed worst of the worst, then all the people in the broader circle beyond it who say, I am not being taken as seriously. My rights, family of somebody who's been killed, are not taken seriously because the killer of that person is not executed, feel worse. And so the death penalty tries to expand to cover them. But it never can get far enough to cover all the people who are in the category that look about the same. And it doesn't get far enough because then we start executing friends of ours, which we're not willing to do. People who are like us rather than like them. What happens, interestingly, is that when a country abolishes the death penalty, it develops a substitute punishment that starts to carry with it the connotation of the state is taking me seriously and really taking my pain seriously. You don't say in Italy, somebody has been sentenced to life imprisonment. You say, l'ergastolo. A word that sounds, oh boy, this is rough. A substitute gets put in that says, boy, are they taking my pain seriously. And it's a substitute which can be applied much more broadly and therefore may do better. So I think that probably even that argument doesn't work. But it's the reason why in the United States the matter is more complicated. Much too long an answer. Questions? Something about, yeah.
I have a follow-up question on that. Follow-up question on that.
I'm sorry?
I have a follow-up question on death penalty. You're convinced that you're against death penalty in the United States. And as you know, in China we have death penalty and we execute people like them, a lot of them every year. And I wonder, your objection, is it absolute or is it subject to qualifications like China is a developing country? Maybe death penalty serves a better purpose than it serves in the States, or?
Well, again, I said earlier that I find it hard to make judgments about other countries, and so I do not want to make judgments about other countries. On the other hand, I myself, for my own moral reasons, don't like the idea of killing anybody anywhere. And so I would find that very difficult to apply. Many of the reasons that get used in China for the death penalty sound like reasons that have not worked in other countries. So I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical, and of course it is a very effective means of keeping those in power precisely when it is exercised in an arbitrary way. When those who get killed happen to be those who are not friends of those in power. and we've done the same thing. And so I think of the death penalty in the south of the United States, which was certainly a developing country in some ways, and how it was exercised there to keep down certain people and keep the people in power. So I am skeptical about whether it can be justified in China. But that's always with the saying that I am conscious of what I can say and what cannot. And this leads me to that question which I raised just before of how much should a judge in one country use the law of another country. You know, in some of the death penalty cases in the United States, some justices of the Supreme Court have said, look to Europe and see that they don't have it in deciding whether this penalty is cruel and unusual. It may be common in the United States, but it isn't common in the Western world. To what extent should a judge look to the law or to the economics of law of another country in deciding things in her own and his own country? And that's much debated. There are people like Scalia and Thomas who say, no, you may not look outside your own country. And there are other people like Justice Stevens, Breyer, and Souter who say, no, you should. Well, it's more complicated. If what you're asking is, can you apply the values of another country directly to yours? The answer is, you'd better be very careful before you apply them, because you don't know that much about it. On the other hand, if you're talking about legal techniques that have been developed in other countries, and you see that they're techniques which may be useful to you, why not take advantage of the experiments of other countries? I had a case in which the question had to do with crack and cocaine, and the fact that at the time that crack and cocaine were prohibited in the United States, it was thought that these two were very different from each other. Over time, we came to realize that their effects were about the same, not that different, and also that crack was used primarily by minorities, and crack cocaine, was used primarily by whites. So that the effect of having sentences for crack, which were 100 times more severe than those for crack, was highly discriminatory. At the time the law was passed, we couldn't say that that law violated equal protection, because given what they knew, and there was no evidence that anybody was trying to be discriminatory, that law was a perfectly acceptable law, and yet we were learning more. So what do we do? It's very hard to say when a law has gotten to the point that now it is discriminatory. It's almost impossible for a court. Well, I was sitting on a panel, and I said, maybe what we should do is adopt a technique that the Italian Constitutional Court and then the German and the Austrian Constitutional Courts adopted, which was of laws heading towards unconstitutionality. That is, the court doesn't hold it unconstitutional now, but says it is heading towards unconstitutionality and speaks to the legislature and says, do something about it, and if you don't in time, we will. Well, I suggested this, and there were two very old judges who said, well, we can't do this. It's the American Constitution, and we're the mother of constitutional law. These people who have constitutions, Italy, Germany, and so on, they're our children. They really can't. And so I wrote a footnote, which gets cited all the time, which says, perhaps we are the mother of constitutional law, but wise parents learn from their children. And the idea is that here as the techniques, there's no reason, because we're not simply taking the values, which may or may not apply, we're learning from techniques. But even as to values, think about it this way, about using the law of other countries. Scalia, in saying that we can't do that, says you should not follow the decision of another country, of courts in another country, because the judges of that country were not appointed by the President of the United States or confirmed by the Senate. Of course not. So what power? Why should you pay any attention to it? The problem with that is that in the United States, since we are a federalism, the courts of Connecticut have from the very beginning, when the law of another state seemed appropriate, cited the courts of Vermont or the courts of California. But the judges in Vermont or California were not appointed by the governor of Connecticut or confirmed by the Senate of Connecticut. All these other places had been in a federalism, but in a world as it is today, cognate places whose values are not irrelevant. The question then is to find those other places whose values are closer to yours, so that the decisions of that court do tell you something about your own situation. Difficult for me to make a judgment about the judgments of China or the judgments of India. Less difficult for me to say when England does this, it's treating something similar. Or take a court in Maine that may find a precedent across the border in Canada to represent more of the same point of view, more of the same values than a court in Texas, for heaven's sakes. Texas is much more different from Maine or Connecticut than Canada is. The question is not an absolute here, yes, there, no. It's to try as judges to find people who in the same situation are dealing with cognate problems in similar ways, but also knowing that there are things that don't fit.
Just to draw upon Ron's question, I was going to ask about the place of moral absolutes, in judicial decision making, because accepting relativism often means applying different standards in different situations.
Okay. Well, the difficulty with moral absolutes is, are those absolutes part of your law? I'm a religious person. And so for me, the death penalty, I think, is an abomination and would be an abomination regardless of these more utilitarian arguments. But as a judge in the United States, I am not allowed to apply my moral absolutes as such. I have to link them to something which is in the American Constitution, which is rarely that absolute. No, it is fairly absolute about some things. There are some things in the Constitution which says Congress shall make no law, period. There are other things which say there shall be no unreasonable searches and seizures. Where it says unreasonable, I have much less power as a judge. I have to listen to the legislature much more as to what is reasonable or not. Where the law says, do this, I as a judge have much more power, because in effect the statement of that absolute is a statement to courts, we prefer you to have that power, than the legislature, which is always balancing, which is always negotiating in that way. But that's if I can find that somewhere in the Constitution. Short of finding that in the Constitution, what I can do with my absolutes is sometimes send it back. Say, you seem to have done something which violates part of what is our tradition and seems like an absolute, but isn't in that language. I want to be sure, you legislature, that you really mean it. Now, there are many ways of doing this kind of second look. Sometimes you do it by saying the law was vague. I did it once in an assisted suicide case by saying directly, this was a law that was passed 150 years ago for other reasons. I don't know if the legislature today needs it. So I'm going to strike it down and let them repass it if they want it. Constitutional remand, I call it. Canada, being somewhere between England and the United States, does it directly through the so-called non obstante clause. The Constitution requires certain things, but the legislature can then come back and pass the thing non obstante, notwithstanding the holding of the court. If they are willing to stand before the people and say, we want to do something which looks as though it violates a moral absolute, which the court has told us to do, we can do it. They don't do that with language. Very absolute is absolute. But there are these ways of dealing with it. But the direct application of the moral absolute is something we can't do. And I must tell you, I once had a case, our now chief judge was presiding, and he's a very conservative man. And it was a case of a bishop and a monk who had blocked an entrance to an abortion clinic because they thought it was wrong. And they had been tried for doing this. The law proved that they couldn't do it, and they'd been convicted. And they took an appeal. And the lawyer for them said, this law prohibiting people from blocking entrance to an abortion clinic violates the natural law, a moral absolute. To which the presiding judge of our court, who I say is very conservative man, himself, I think, very much against abortion, but he gave the answer which I think was inevitable. He said, that's a very powerful argument, but we don't have jurisdiction over natural law. You know? That isn't the law we are applying. And that in the end has to be the answer about those moral absolutes.
I think I'll go back to the issue of creating models of market and commerce with regards to things like life. So I'll build an argument. I think the failure of economics in venturing into this kind of research could not be as a result of neglect, but maybe as a little realization that it's a practical impossibility because of what I would call their derived values. And this is what I mean. Let's take life, for example. You cannot determine the value of even a madman, for example, based on the madman or the value he can exhibit, but because of the perceived derived value based on our societal settings. You can say a man might be worse off, but he can give back to children who can change the world, for example. We have this kind of perceptions. And this kind of believe run through things like health and education, because we don't venture to education because of education or health, but because of their AI value. Funnily, this can be quantified, but with regards to life, we cannot quantify the AI value of someone's life. So could this be the reason why economics is neglecting reach out into building models that can determine who lives, who gets to die, who gets this part or not?
Okay. What he's saying is something very important. That there are some things which we cannot value at all. We cannot value them. And if we cannot value them at all, economics cannot tell us anything about them. You then give a series of examples: health, education, and life. Now, I think that's true up to a point. But can we then say that we will do everything to save these, to save life, or to give education or health? We don't. So we make the decision in a command way, in a governmental, collective way. But making that decision itself has problems, because if we don't want to value life, we also don't want to give certain people who have more power the power to say how much you get and how much he gets. Which means that since in practice we don't save life at any cost, and we don't give education at any cost, or health at any cost, we have to find some way of making trade-offs without valuing it in that way. Now, what makes it especially difficult for life is that it doesn't, even if we wanted to take some kind of pricing, it doesn't have a single price. If I say to you, how much must I pay you to take one chance in 1,000 of losing your life? You would give me a figure which is too high, because I've made you focus on it. And in fact, you probably take a chance of 1 in 1,000 of losing your life for any amount of money. I tell you, oh, go take a train to go deliver that for me, I'll pay you $50, and you do it, and you don't worry about the fact that doing that has a 1 chance in however many. But whatever figure you give me, let's say you give me that you want $5,000 for 1 chance in 1,000 of losing your life. That sounds as though your life is worth $5 million. Does it mean that if I say to you, okay, Guido, I'll give you $2.5 million for 1 chance in 2 of losing your life? You'll tell me you're crazy. And if I say to you, I know what your life is worth, you've told me, it's $5 million. I need your heart. Here's $5 million. Thank you very much. Let me take it for a transplant. You'd throw me out the window. That is, the value of life is not independent from the chance of losing it and how we lose it. We value life more in terms of a big airplane crash, because that sounds awful. We value life more in terms of kidneys than heart transplants. Any number of things that way. That makes it easier to hide the trade-offs, but it doesn't mean that the trade-offs in some way don't exist. Now, does that mean that economists can't tell us anything? I don't know. Who will tell us? I mean, these choices are being made. No? We decide how fast cars can go. We decide, when I wrote that little article early on, the decision for accidents, which I wrote early on, we said that we decide to have accidents. The New York Times thundered in an editorial, when life is at stake, no amount of money is too much. And I almost wrote them a letter and said, I'm glad to hear it. I take it that means that your delivery trucks will now drive no faster than 5 miles an hour. And then I didn't write that letter because I came to a realization that though I was saying something which was true, that we are always trading off life, they were also saying something which was true, but we don't want to hear it that way.
So I'm just thinking, I think the only hope could be if we can venture into something I want to call moral economics. And I am building these thoughts on your explanation of trade-offs. I think the most acceptable trade-offs in society recognized by law have been carried out on a moral basis. Let's take, for example, the US will say if some robbers kidnap someone, they might not give in into negotiations because they might sacrifice, there could be a danger of them killing the hostage. But the US will say if we give in, we're encouraging the habits of robbery, for example. So in that case, they might value not, encouraging the idea of taking people into hostage over the person's life. And relatives might be okay because this is done on a moral basis, for example. A soldier might say, I will go to war for my country and I will die for my country, for example. This is done on a moral basis. So the only hope could be like moral economics.
What you're saying is that sometimes the trade-off can be of an ideal against another ideal, and then we can measure in terms of ideals rather than money, and do something which is not that different from economics, but done on a wholly different pricing system. Sometimes we do that by having a system of rationing in which we trade off broccoli against spinach directly rather than in a generalized market. During the Second World War, that's what we did with Greenstacks. Sometimes we set up a market in time. Sometimes we can say, if you give your kidney, we will guarantee that if you need another transplant of any sort, you will have it. That is, these are all markets that are very different from the classical economic market, but which try to put things on both sides of the balance, which are somehow sufficiently equivalent that they are not morally troubling. So we may say, yes, life, but go to war and this in exchange. What you just said to me is what lay behind what I was trying to say, that if economists get beyond the simple money market, they may be able to be of help. I'm not saying that they can solve things, but they may tell us something which will be helpful to us in making these decisions, which are far more difficult than how many bananas or how many shoes, but which we in fact make all the time in the tragic situation of our life. Do you want to call them economists? Don't call them economists. Call them moralists.
Man economists.
Call them whatever you want. Call them Thucydides. Call them mustard plaster. I don't care what you call them, but if they are talking about trade-offs and are analyzing trade-offs so that we don't just make the decision by our guts, you know, this is how I want it, which all too often means that people in power get to make the decision, but that we can actually do an analysis and see how the things are done, then we can do something. This again is back to Bentham and Mill. You know, it has to be much more complicated than simply saying, oh well, it's the unanalyzed wisdom experience. Leave it at that means that whatever has been done before continues to be, and that often is awful. We have to analyze whether China really needs the death penalty today. Not just. Yeah, you go. You haven't spoken before, so I want you to speak.
What if legislators made
Louder.
what if legislators made a law which needs economic analysis and also promotes altruism? I mean, it's a good law, but the public didn't buy it. The public think it's against the public opinion. There's a good example of the death penalty in China. We still have death penalty, and there's a report, not by the domestic agency, by a German agency in 2008. It said, based on those ask people in Beijing, Hubei, and Guangdong. This three provinces the most developed province in China, which they accept those Western cultures. However, it shows that almost 60% people against favors death penalty. Only 14 are against. So it shows the public also there are other reports by the domestic agency. So what should the legislature do? Should they also in 2006, I think, is the legislation revised the criminal law. It said they eliminate some crimes which those the criminals can be sent to the death. Could be sent to death. So they eliminate some crimes, but still the public. There's some people criticize this.
Yeah.
Especially considering the corruption, because corruption is very serious in China. So those people think those corrupt officials, if you allow them, if you abolish death penalty, they can walk away. So because they have the power, the court is not independent in China. So it would be more easily to walk away from the punishment.
Okay. Now there are several things in what you said that I understood correctly. One is, what do you do if a majority of people want a law that you think is unjust? Now, remember when I said the formal system this morning, it was either the tyranny of history, or the tyranny of revolution, or the tyranny of a majority. That what the majority wants, that's it. To some people, the problem with the majority is that though in the end we may want to be democratic and let the majority have its way, that often the majority does not know, is not capable of having analyzed a thing, and that part of the job of scholars, and of course, is to present the majority with another way. I don't think the death penalty has ever been abolished by a majority. That is, I think when it was abolished in every place, if you actually looked to the polls of a majority of people were for it. What is interesting is that in most countries where it was abolished, it didn't take that long afterwards for a majority to be comfortable with it without the death penalty. Otherwise it would have come back. But, so what do you do in a situation in which the radical reformer, using whether economics, using something else, comes out with a conclusion that some set of laws make no sense? What does democracy mean in this sense? You know, very few of us would be willing to have democracy mean referenda all the time on every issue. And that's not because referenda can't be done. It used to be that it couldn't, but today with computers, it would be very easy to make laws which would say, what do you think about this? Click, click, click. And that's a democracy. The democracies we have always been more complicated. They are things which ultimately leave an authority to the majority, but in the interim have any number of other ways of treating the issue, especially where the issue then becomes of discrimination, so we protect some from that. The question is, with respect to some of these issues, is there enough evidence to slow democracy down and say, you have the last say, but in the interim, some other way, whether it's a radical reform analysis by somebody else, courts, or something else, does it. How much inertia do you build up for these decisions? If there were no inertia, it wouldn't matter whether a court said the law is A or B, because the legislature would simply pass it the other way. In fact, almost all systems of government have created inertia intentionally so that the people may ultimately be able to speak, but only ultimately. There was one of the framers of the American Constitution, a man named Wilson, who spoke about legislation, the making of laws, in a very negative way. Because, yeah, ultimately, the people through the legislature make laws, but do we really want them to make laws that quickly? Or are there any number of impediments? A constitution, a written constitution, says as to some things, there's even more inertia. That's the end of the world. Constitutions can be changed. We modify. Justices of the court change. It does change, but it does more slowly. How many times do we want to tie ourselves to the mast, as Ulysses did, so that we don't respond to the immediate siren song, which is democracy? I don't know. But I wouldn't say just because a majority at this point wants something, that there's anything particularly so. Now, I say that, I'm a person who is very fond of juries, which is essentially a democratic way of doing things. Lots of people don't like juries. There's juries deciding things. Well, juries, you know, picked from the people, are as democratic, more democratic than legislatures in many ways. And people don't like them because of that. Juries represent the unspoken and often unspeakable values of that society. Often. To what extent do we choose to use them when legislatures? This, by the way, is that third approach to law, the legal process law, which says, when do you trust the decision to be made in the first instance by the majority directly, for referendum or in some way, when instead do you mediate it through some other ways? So that's one part. The other thing, which I think you were saying, only kind of in passing, was the difference between Beijing and the provinces. That is, you were saying, after all, there's a big difference between the values of this place and the values of other parts. And that's a very interesting and quite different thing, which I was adverting to a little bit before when I spoke about Texas and Vermont and how different they are. The advantage of a system, whether nominally a federalism or not, where it is not called a federalism but actually acts as one, is that it allows people to stay in the same country, even though their values are profoundly different. And it's a very interesting question of when we are willing to tolerate values that are very different in another part of my country. I believe that actually Europe has been able to stay together without a strong central government, because in Europe, despite everything, the values are not that different. Germany, Italy, oh yes, we speak different languages and so on. There's much more difference in values between Vermont, Connecticut, and Texas in the United States. Much more difference. And in fact, the United States would not have been able to stay together as a country if there hadn't been a very strong central government, which now a crisis may call for, but before was not needed in Europe. The Civil War is the example. The United States would split apart because the North was anti-slavery and the South was slavery. Fundamental difference. But that differences exist still now. So the question is, how much am I willing to accept the immorality of Texas, that it executes people all the time and does all sorts of things which I think disgusting, in order to let Texas accept my immorality, that in Connecticut gays can get married, and that we can do all sorts of things which in Texas would be an abomination. When is it that in a federal system we say, no, this has to be so across the country? That's what we said with respect to slavery, with respect to segregation in the United States, with respect to abortion. But we haven't said it, we've said the other with respect to assisted suicide, with respect to the death penalty, with respect to gay marriage. There are things that we are willing to let different parts do, which we may think are awful, just because then they'll let us do our thing and still be part of the same nation. I don't know how much China is willing to live with the values of Fujian province, how much Beijing instead can determine. How much in Italy are we Piemontesi, Falsi, Cortesi, or Sicilians? The differences are less in some ways. Okay.
I've got a question that comes from the sample case you gave this morning of the bone marrow and of the bone marrow transplant, and an applicant applying to force another person to give bone marrow, which led to the question of distribution and whether we should give things according to need. I guess my question was about whether you think it's possible for the US legal system to incorporate that sort of thought in its law, based on the fact, like all states, that the legal system is a state-based system. It's also based on individual property and freedom. And if we look at a question of distribution, for me what comes to mind most isn't bone marrow, although obviously you can't, any life is very, very important, but things like access to water or food in a world where there's inequality of distribution to the point that it causes death, and how state legal systems, whether it's possible for legal systems as they are to consider the question of need in determining who gets what property. I don't know if I articulated that.
at the moment, it's very difficult to imagine an American legal system which generically says, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. That is, I think it's very difficult to do that in America, not only in terms of America itself, but in terms of what you went to very quickly afterwards, what that implies for the world. Because if you really do that and say we owe that to other people as creative, as creatures, then why stop at the border? And I don't think they're willing to think that way. I think that what may be possible, and they'll also say, by the way, if we really do that, we don't have enough incentives. What I think may be possible is to figure out that there are some goods which we all think of as being important enough so that we don't like having them be allocated according to a prevailing wealth distribution, what I call in some of my writings merit goods, but which we think people should have apart from the distribution of wealth, or at least a minimum level of. And then as to those, they should have them at least up to a minimal level up to their needs. So what I am pushing myself for is something which is a little bit less dramatic than what you're saying, but saying, get to the point where a certain basic level of health, a certain basic level of education, a certain basic level of life safety is given to everybody and not tradable off. And then if we have that, maybe we don't mind even using a pure market for the excess. For those who want to have special private schools, well, screw them, let them pay for it. Or for those who want to have extra special, for those who ride the Frecciarossa first class, I can't imagine why. Second class is perfectly good. So if there are some people who really want to spend more money and go first class, all right, with respect to those. Something along that line with respect to some goods, which then says, beyond that, we may be even willing to price the good, which is unpriceable at its basic level, we may be able to get to. And it's that which people like me are arguing for. And by the way, we're using a rather odd argument in order to convince some people on the other side that it's okay. We say, listen, if you let us give this level of basic good to everybody according to their need, then we'll let you have a capitalisme sauvage beyond that, which will give you the incentives which you think are needed for more things and differences and so on. Well, if you don't, we're going to push for greater generalized equality, which you don't like, because that will reduce the number of incentives. So if we're trying to say, hey, you know, some of the things you care about, you may do better if we can give everybody at least a basis in something like that. And I think that that may be a way in which we can structure a society, a social democratic way, if you want, which is neither all command nor all market. And sometimes when I want to get silly, I think that the reason for the miracle of Italy of the 50s and 60s was that without knowing it, the 50s and 60s was a country in which virtually everybody had a state, parastate, parastate, something or other job, which gave them certain basic levels of education, health, pension, and so on. It wasn't a job that required much attention. It didn't require that much. You'd do that in the morning, go home, sleep with the person you loved, get up afterwards, and in the afternoon, I'm speaking symbolically, be involved in the underground economy, which paid no taxes, which was not a good thing, but which was absolute capitalism of the wildest form, but which had tremendous drive. Now, can you do that in something which is not underground economy and illegal, but something which both recognizes, not as a matter of giving to the poor, because if you think of it only as welfare, as giving to the poor, then the rich will always say they are cheating. You know, if you give it as a safety net to the poor, oh, they're the welfare cheats, they're the people who are lazy, they're the ones who don't, and often there's racism added to it and so on. If instead you say, this is the right of every creature, of every citizen. That's why Social Security in the United States is untouchable. It's untouchable because I get Social Security. Heaven's sakes, Social Security pays between me and my wife about $4,000 a month. And I'm wealthy. I don't need it, it's a waste. But it's not a waste, because lots of people like me then don't think of it as something which is giveaway to the poor, but a pension right that everybody should have. And so it's not touchable. So if you could do that for enough things according to basic needs, then you might be able not to worry about the rest. I don't know. Thank you very much, and we'll see you tomorrow morning and talk about shaping values. How do we say what values are worth having, even in the Ukraine?